Part 2 of speech perception. So one of the nice points that is made by talking about allophones and this articulation that these, because of the different contexts and because of co-articulation, that those allophones are produced really very differently, right? We have this variability of speech, often discussed as a lack of invariance, and we want to be able to still hear the d, that phoneme d, whether it is in d or do, right? And here's this example of that formant transition, the d sound in d and do. The first or the lowest formant transition is very similar, but when we get up to the higher one, in D, because of the way that vowel, those formants are higher, that formant transition goes from about 2400 hertz to about 2800 hertz, something like that. So it's moving up and up in that high range, versus in do, because those formants are lower. Now that formant transition is going from about 1100 hertz down to about 800 hertz. So it's going down, and it's down at a lower area as well. And so how do we hear d, right, in those two really different contexts? We can take the word bag. So if we look at the oblique lines there that are representing, this is the b, and the where we see the effects of b, and then the dots oblique lines that says this is the g, and where we have an influence of the g in this kind of co-articulation. Then when we look at bag, which those ovally like things are trying to show us the formants, right? If we look at bag, that a is being affected by the b for more than the first half, and by the g for more than the second half, where there's actually this overlap of how b and g are affecting the formants that I'm creating when I'm saying the a in bag. And so we just looked at a formant transition and in our consonants and how they're affected by the vowels, but now we're looking at how a vowel is affected by its consonants. So that that a in bag is going to be different than the a in had. And you can say, well, they sound really similar, but I can make it more pronounced by using these nasals. It's very different than the a in man, right? Man has a different a, and you can hear how much more nasally it is because it's between these two nasals, and yet you still hear it as a. I'm not really changing your perception, right? We have this perceptual constancy of that a sound. And this representation comes from Lieberman in 1957. I think your author talks about this to some extent, that instead of these phonemes being like beads on a string, they're a little bit more like pouring Jello into a mold, right? That it mixes. I don't think it mixes quite as much as Jello, as that's just going to become a slosh, but it's pretty close to being just a slosh, because we are influencing each phoneme with its context and the phonemes around it in this process of co-articulation. And I just used the concept, or talked about the concept, of a perceptual constancy. So the fact that we hear the sound of the phoneme as really being the same, even though that acoustic signal is changing wildly because of co-articulation, that's an example of a perceptual constancy. And while because of the way we ended up not talking about the higher level aspects of vision and getting to things like color perception, in color perception we're going to talk about perceptual constancies again, because really what our sensory systems want to give us is a stable world, right, where we have these perceptual constancies, and we can kind of really learn to rely on things and recognize the objects and the things in our environments. Sometimes in object recognition as well, we talk about shape. You know, if I see the shape of a door and it's a rectangle, I open it and that shape is really changing on the retina, right? But I perceive it as still being that rectangle just from a different perspective, and that's another example of a perceptual constancy. And so if we look at this co-articulation, what's interesting is it happens not just within a word like bag or di and do, but between words as well, because if we look at the silence between the words, it's less than 40% of the silence that we see in the speech spectrograms. And in fact, we'll see, and I know I have a couple out there which I'll come back to at some point. If you have the, I think it's the sp in speech, so those two voiceless, the voiceless fricative and the voiceless stop, because they're voiceless, there's more silence there than between some of the words that I'm saying here. So if you, and this isn't how we read, right? If we had to read like this, it would be very difficult indeed. And this is a good example from the book, which you should pause and think, can I read this? What does this say? And usually I have students piece this together in class. I've had 1 or 2 students throughout the years since 2012 teaching this, just read it and say, okay, I got that right away. I still read it as their donate a kettle of tin chips. That's not what it says, right? That doesn't make sense. It says the red on a tea kettle often chips. So we don't have to read like that. We are hearing speech like that. It is co-articulated, and those words, there's no real silence between them. There's some more neat studies looking at this. In a now really classic study from 1964 by Pollock and Pickett, they did this study where, so the participants were, presumably they were waiting for another, so for the experimenters to get ready or for another participant or something, and they're waiting in this waiting area, and there's a Confederate out there, so another researcher who's asking them questions and getting them to talk. And then they come in, and what the researchers have done is they've recorded some of the speech from that participant, from them themselves, and then they go in and they try to, they isolate specific words from that person, and that person has to recognize their own speech, identify isolated words from their own speech. And they were at under 50%. They were not, this is not easy to do, because when we're talking, even with strangers, we are not saying, what are you doing? As we see in that first speech spectrogram at the top there, these nice silences where we say what, we enunciate that word, pause, are. We don't talk like that, right? What do we do? What you doing? What are you doing? And so if you're looking for the word are in there and what are you doing, it's more like, right? So it's really difficult to recognize even our own speech if it's isolated. So we're going to talk about how we are doing this, and I'm going to talk a lot about different ways that we use different aspects of context. Actually, we use everything we possibly can. I've talked about co-articulation, and so some of the variability of those speech sounds even within a speaker, right, because of co-articulation, but we also have other reasons for variability. So emotion, I can be excited and I'm talking in an excited way, or I can sound kind of sad or maybe tired, or as long as I'm not really slurring, you can still understand what I'm saying. We can even talk with gum in our mouths really easily. I've had a few almost conversations with my nephew and niece brushing my teeth, and as long as I don't get too complicated while I'm trying to brush my teeth, they can even understand me there. We have variability between speakers, so dialectal differences. When I gave that example before of most of us say butter and have this flap because we are American. Most of us, I don't know actually where you all are from, you all sounded American on your flip grid things, but so if you hear a British person say butter and it's in this context, you're probably going to understand what they're saying, even though they say it really differently. Sometimes it takes a little while to get to know an accent, but we can learn different dialects relatively easily. We speak at different rates. I tend to speak a little bit more quickly than a lot of Southerners, but different people speak at different rates. Different genders, we tend to either be more high or low pitched depending on gender, and those, like pulling that pitch up or pulling that pitch down, doesn't influence whether you hear me say bought and ah as in bought, then I as in bit, right? You can still hear that. You'd hear that if my pitch was higher or if my pitch was lower. You can still hear the qualities of those vowels. So one of the main things that's helping us to do this is that we have this categorical perception. Our phonemes have clear phonetic boundaries, and even though there's variability, if it fits within that boundary, we're going to categorize it as being that particular phoneme, right? So we have a wide range of acoustic signals, but we're going to categorize those phonemes as t versus d, which is a really good example because we're going to move to some research looking at exactly that change in voice onset time. So if we look at da, my vocal cords start vibrating at about 17 milliseconds when I'm saying da. Whereas if I say ta, that comparison, my vocal cords start vibrating more at like 91 milliseconds into ta. So what Imus and Corbett did in 1973 was they manipulated this by computer so that they would be systematically going from, so basically we're looking at a threshold, right? The threshold of when does this change from da to ta? And then what does that mean as far as what you're hearing? So if we look at a 25 millisecond difference, and for every one of these, if my math is wrong, I apologize, but because I'm going to do this on the fly. But so for each of these, I have a 25 millisecond difference. So let's just say I'm between 5 milliseconds and 30 milliseconds, and I systematically 5, 10, 15, 20. So 5 to 30 milliseconds is a 25 millisecond difference, and we play that for people, and they say those sound the same. If we go up above, so we get past that phonemic boundary or phonetic boundary to get to ta, and I go, let's say, from 50 milliseconds to 75 milliseconds, they hear that as ta, and they say, okay, that sounds the same. There's a 25 millisecond difference between when that voice onset starts, and yet sounds the same. But let's take that difference from about 25 milliseconds to about 50 milliseconds, that 25 millisecond difference. Now, because we're crossing that phoneme boundary, people say those sound different. So this categorical perception is, regardless of this variability, if it's basically under 35 milliseconds with that voice onset time, I'm going to hear it as da. And if it's over 40 milliseconds with that voice onset time, I'm going to hear it as ta. And that's for our language, right? So if I looked at a different language, like Spanish, my understanding is that they have a couple of different ta sounds that I can't make because I can't hear the difference. I'm going to go ahead and say that while we have this lack of invariance and lots of variability in our speech within and between speakers, there are a few examples here that I'm going to use that show that we use every piece of information that we have in order to understand speech. It's actually, it sounds like it should be a lot of hefty processing, but yet, again, seems rather seamless most of the time. So looking at the role of context, Richard Warren did this study called which ended up being called the phonemic restoration effect, or he found the phonemic restoration effect with this study. And if you remember, we actually saw him do a similar kind of study with tones when we looked at auditory continuity. But so here he has sentences, and he takes out a letter sound And if that is just silence, just like we did with the auditory tone that's staying the same, we obviously hear those silences, and that's missing a letter there. But he replaced it with a cough, or at least that's what's sometimes said. I think it was more a broadband noise. Again, he likes to use those broadband noises, but a cough would be like similar to a broadband noise. If that missing letter is replaced with a cough, the missing letter is heard, and people cannot correctly place where the cough occurred. I did find, I've had this link on here for a long time, and it hasn't led to anything good, as I hadn't found a good new. They took off my phonemic restoration effect, and the one that I really liked a lot. I did find a new video. It does have the man's face, and I'm going to end up talking about how we also use visual information, and so that works better if you don't watch him, you just listen to the video, which will be on Blackboard. One of the things the man does as well in that video is to have this ambiguity, where you're filling in the ambiguity. I actually heard it wrong, but so if there was time to save, where the asterisk is a silence replaced by a cough or a sound, a broadband noise, this is ambiguous at this point, right? If there was time to ave, that could be save, shave, wave, rave. And then if participants heard something like people were saying goodbye to a departing friend on a boat, I think pretty sure it was a boat, then people will go back actually in time and restore that phoneme again. So we don't need necessarily that context to come before the missing sound. We're going to hear what is supposed to be there, even if that context comes after. We feel like we heard that sound. Miller and Isard did another study looking at how sentence context can help us to hear those phonemes of those words. And so before it was about the sentence context and what makes sense in a particular sentence, but this one shows that it's not just about semantics, but also grammar. The structure of the language also gives us an in. It helps us to understand. So in these examples, people would hear one of these, but they heard examples of normal grammatical sentences, anomalous but grammatical sentences, and ungrammatical strings. But this is so one of the things that was really nicely counterbalanced and really in this very well designed study is that the same words would be in these different possibilities, but then people would just hear one of those with the same words, if that makes sense, because that leaves it where all of those words are the same frequency, same length, all of these things that we want to keep controlled in these kinds of language studies. So a normal grammatical sentence they might hear would be gadgets simplify work around the house. And what they're doing is they're shadowing. So they're hearing this and then they're saying it out loud. Gadgets simplify work around the house as they're hearing it. Hearing anomalous, so semantically anomalous means that it doesn't make sense, semantic sense, but still grammatical, like gadgets kill passengers from the eyes, which that doesn't make any sense, but it does have the grammar or the structure of the language is still maintained. And then they could also hear ungrammatical strings that would of course be semantically anomalous as well. So this example, between gadgets, highways, passengers, the steal, which I love talking gibberish, and I get to do it one more time as we are going to talk about language for a little while. If we're looking at a normal grammatical sentence, and again, this is a shadowing study where I'm hearing that sentence and I'm repeating it out loud, people are at about 89% accuracy, which is really quite good. I have people do this in class sometimes when I actually do a dichotic listening study where they're listening to two people, but they're supposed to shadow one, and it's difficult for them. I am adding a lot of noise, but we'll talk about that as well. With the anomalous but grammatical string, they are at 79% accuracy, so we've lost some of the accuracy there, losing the semantics, the meaning. But notice what happens when we get to an ungrammatical string. Now we don't have the structure or the meaning, and I lose it down to 56% accuracy. And this example is actually without noise, me just repeating, but let's add some noise. So shadowing with a high level of background noise. Am I hearing those phonemes? Well, in normal grammatical sentences, I'm still at 63% accuracy. So we're using sentence context, and we're going to see it's both the semantics and the structure and grammar that we're using all of that information to help us recognize or hear these phonemes. The anomalous, so semantically anomalous but grammatical sentence was at 22% accuracy, so I've kind of lost it there. But look at what happens with the ungrammatical string. 3%, I'm really kind of close to zero, right? So the grammar was getting me into some of those sounds, but not as nearly as much as having something that is grammatical and makes sense. I think one of my final examples here of how we are using, again, every source of information that we possibly can to hear the phonemes, to hear the sounds in our language. The McGurk effect is a great example of what they call audio-visual speech perception, the fact that visual information influences what we hear. So if you went and you listened to, as I suggested, or if you do after this, go and listen to the phonemic restoration effect, and then try it again, watching his face. And I know this gives you a bit of it's a confound because you just listen to the same thing, but the McGurk effect, and there's a video here as well, which I usually show enough to get it. She kind of talks over him a bit, so and as long as you are seeing the effect and experiencing the effect, that when he's saying ba, 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 but his lips are going fa, 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 and we're watching his lips, we tend to hear it as fa, fa, fa. We misperceive actually that phoneme because that visual information is apparently very strong. I have it in another example in a video that I watched from Brain Games where she's going ga, 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 and it sounds like it's somewhere in between ba and ga, which is also a really kind of neat effect. But we are using information from people's mouths. And if you think about it, so this is a video that you're most likely going to watch in relative quiet, but we're especially using information from people's mouths and faces and eyes and what they're looking at and everything when we're listening to speech in a relatively noisy environment. So if you think about going out to eat at one of those places with bad acoustics and you're talking with your family, you're really using every bit of information as you possibly can to understand and hear the appropriate phonemes and understand people's speech.